So what is this about DC throwing away all their continuity? Are they doing that? Well, there's a story over at Bleeding Cool, and then there's been some videos and some analysis. And over on Thinking Critical, Wes and Joe Corallo did a great analysis of what this is all about. But I wanted to throw my 2 cents into kind of the mix. This is an area where I can't comment too much on it, but I did want to kind of give you a little bit of a sense of why DC is doing this, what it all means, and the odds, the likely odds of how all this turns out. Hey everybody, this is Perch talking about DC Omniverse, or whether that's an official term or not. But basically, this idea that has been kind of spun out in various different ways that DC is changing comics continuity, and it may be a faster way to say this is DC is going to forget about comic continuity. That's not a completely accurate way of describing what's going on, but it is kind of the talking point to what people are talking about, to what's being said. And in general, to really kind of understand what's happening, you've got to turn the clock back a little bit to something Dan Didio was really after and trying to accomplish, which was to make all the continuity make sense. And this is something I've talked about on this channel before. People at Marvel have also tried to do this as well. It's where I know Tom Brevoort's a big fan of this. I think Jordan White as well kind of weighs in on this from time to time. But it's this idea that, hey, we need to have a timeline that makes sense, that Iron Man can't possibly have been back in Vietnam, and that the Fantastic Four couldn't have possibly stolen a rocket ship to be kind of imbued with cosmic radiation during the Soviet space race, because they'd be dead by now. They'd be long dead. I mean, Franklin would be in his 60s, or whatever the case may be. It's the same argument that goes, the Dark Phoenix saga happened about 4 or 5 years ago in Marvel time. And people get way too fixated on what Marvel time is or what DC time is. And I mentioned this in the past. At various times, DC has tried to clean up their continuity with crisis events and kind of other pieces. And as we're getting into death metal, one of the things that Scott Snyder said a lot about is, number one, everything matters. We're going to make everything matter again. And then he's calling this kind of the anti-crisis, the opposite of the crisis. And basically what he was getting at was that we have all these stories floating around through Black Label, through Crisis, pre-crisis, post-crisis. And here is where I really agree with a lot of what Snyder was kind of coming at, which was most readers, they want all these stories to matter, and they don't really want to care too much about what goes where. More than a year ago now, Dan Didio was constructing this giant, flowchart PowerPoint that would have like the entire timeline, so you could reconcile, how Wonder Woman came along, and she was the first superhero that appeared before Superman, and just this kind of very elaborate when everything took place and how it all fit in continuity. And my general answer to all that is, why? Why are they doing that? What is the point of that? Most people fundamentally don't care. They don't need that level of detail. It's more harmful than beneficial. Most people are just up for reading a good story. Comic fans definitely like to debate, when this story happened here, and they love to nitpick into the continuity and where things fit. And you can still give them that and maintain a loose sense of continuity without basically throwing everything out the window. And what DC Omniverse and everything else is doing, I think this is a lot of hype, and they're definitely going to kind of promote this idea of being a cleaner, more accessible universe. And the reason they're doing that fundamentally is for Warner Media and for these other kind of outlets that they go to. If they start really pushing on digital and trying to get new readers in, and they're going to new territories around the world, the last thing DC wants to have to do and wants to have to explain is, well, this story comes before that story, and you have to read Crisis, but you don't pay attention to this parts of Crisis, and then this multi-universal event, we discarded these pieces. That stuff becomes chaos. That is the stuff that drives new readers away, and that's what DC is trying to solve. However, Bleeding Cool kind of went down this path, and others are speculating. It does not mean things are swinging so far in the other direction that nothing matters. In fact, to the contrary, the goal is to make everything matter and have it all kind of go up on the board, not to remove things. And that's where we're going to land here. At the end of the day, a lot of creators are going to come in, they're going to make stories, and they're not going to worry too much about whether Harley Quinn could technically be in this issue of Suicide Squad and her solo title and whatever she's doing in Batman all at the same time. Maybe the rendition of Harley Quinn, because it does look like she's settling in as a more main ongoing character in Tynion's run of Batman. But they're going to have a solo Harley Quinn book as well, which probably have a very different tone, different feel than what's going on in that book. And they're not going to worry about it. Basically, the answer for DC is we're not going to worry about it anymore. We're just going to let the stories go out. Yes, there will be some discrepancies between them, but don't think too hard and it'll be fine. That's what they're in effect going with. And they're doing this because it's too complicated any other direction. And in that regard, I agree with what DC is doing. Please don't get me wrong. This isn't like DC is throwing away anything. It's not like saying the comics don't matter. The comics will either matter or not matter depending on how good they are at the end of the day. That's really where the rubber meets the road. But what you're getting here from the company is basically to dodge or get out of the way of all this continuity insanity that they're really not good at. The problem was with Didio's plan, and any time a company's done this, including Marvel, is they're not terribly good at handling the continuity. They tend to get bogged down in their own mess. They tend to start to they just screw it up. They can't hold to it. There's too many moving parts and too many comics getting made that if you're trying to do a really aggressive, very, very hard run for continuity, it blows up. It blows up really, really quickly. So don't do it. Just let the stories go out and hopefully they match together. This is a hard thing to do because a lot of comic fans really want to get involved in paying attention to all this stuff. And the funny part is, if it's a year from now, I'm reasonably certain that we're going to have the same arguments, the same kind of comparisons between this reality and this multiverse and that multiverse and where this story happened. We're going to continue to have these debates. I think what DC is kind of signaling is that they're not going to try and weigh in or fix it. DC is not going to come into the picture and say, you know what, this story comes before that story and you have to, they're just not going to bother. They're going to let you figure it out for yourself. And that'll either work or it won't work. But that's basically where DC is going. That's what the DC Omniverse is. This is one of those cases where I'm not saying don't worry about it. I'm not saying worry about it. I'm saying it's probably not a thing. If you didn't read this story and you just kept reading the DC comics, odds are you wouldn't even notice anything's happening. In March, we are going to get some messaging and some marketing around how everything counts and all the stories matter. And, now, there'll probably be some fancy way of saying, you'll get to see different versions of Batman and don't worry about it. You're going to get that kind of messaging. It's not going to be a big deal to you. Unless you really want to worry or think about this or really become fixated upon it, you're not going to really notice. Now, that could be either good or bad, depending on your perspective. It just is. It just is what it is. I think the people who are going to be most obsessed about this Omniverse story are probably going to be people like Bleeding Cool, maybe some YouTubers, but there's going to be people who really want to make this out to more than it is, and it's not really anything. That's my perspective anyway. And depending on how you view DC, it not really mattering is either a good thing because you don't care, or it's a horrible thing because they're further wrecking parts of their own continuity. I don't know. You decide. Overall, what do you think about DC's continuity? Do you care? Do you think about this very often? What about Marvel's? Do you keep track in your mind of when Tony Stark was born and how in the Dark Phoenix saga you have a bunch of people running around in 70s clothing and using payphones, but technically if this happened 4 years ago, they're at some kind of crazy 70s cosplay party all the time and wear their iPhones. This stuff doesn't make terrible sense. And I guess my perspective, it doesn't need to. We can just read these comics. We don't have to become obsessed with it. The more we become obsessed with it, the more we potentially just ruin the whole thing. But what do you think about continuity? Do you think about these things? Do you care about these things? Or at the end of the day, do you just want a good story and the rest just kind of works itself out? Leave me a comment below. Let me know what you think about it. Let me know how much you care about continuity. Like, subscribe, please check to see if you're still subscribed. YouTube tends to bounce people from time to time, but this channel is growing and I really appreciate all your support to get to where it is. And most importantly, as always, thanks for listening.